All right, we're on chapter 7 now. Chapter 7, 3 Bags Full by Leonie, Swann. This is a very special book to the Good Shepherd, Natalie, who's me. And, well, as the Good Shepherd, I don't really have a lot of time to sit around and read books. And yet, this book is so special to me because it is a sheep Good Shepherd murder mystery, which means the Good Shepherd's murdered. Come on, how could I not read this book, right? And yet, I also decided to include my mother along this journey with me. Yes, a journey of reading a book, because otherwise, if I didn't have someone else to love and share with, then what is the good of doing anything that I do? Today, we're reading chapter 7, 3 Bags Full. No one answers to Zora. A white butterfly, a milk dancer, a piece of wind silk flew by. Silk was made from caterpillars, huge flocks of little crawling worms. Humans boiled the worms and stole their skin. Sheep were shorn. Humans didn't mind whether they covered their own bare skin with worm juice or wool, so long as it was white, so long as it kept them warm. They all wanted to be as white as lambs, but they couldn't bear it. They came out in colors. They stank. They were still naked, though. That was the secret, the naked secret. Human beings stood naked before things, delivered up to things, betrayed by and betraying things. What had it been this time? A spade, wasn't that it? The memory made him shake with laughter. A singeing sadness crept up his left hind hoof. It was a fine day, and he was drowning in green. The fluttering white scrap above him had no chance against the green. The fragrant air wafted around him. The air singer willingly sank down. Green stretched all the way to the horizon. Green was the song of unreason. It grew without sense or understanding, urging all creatures to do the same, and they did. Green was the most beautiful commandment in the world. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, another voice had appeared on the horizon. The little red voice sang its way through the madness of the world. A wandering poppy, a hot breath trudged along the country road. Only a fool would have gained and ignored the red. He straightened up, puffing for breath, and peered through the tall grass. The crow on his back flew up in the air. A woman was coming down the road. She was concealed by a straw hat with a very broad brim that threw a sharp shadow right down to her neck. But she must be a young woman. She was carrying a suitcase with ease. Only a very young woman would have dared to wear such a red dress, red as the heart's blood from her shoulders to her calves. A fresh, strong scent went ahead of her, darkened by earth and healthy sweat, a scent to fall in love with. She stopped and put her case down in the middle of the road. That wasn't clever. A car could suddenly come out of the green nowhere and splash her dress over the tarmac. He didn't run the risk of going on roads himself, but the woman was not bothered. She was tall and stood well above the green, reason and fire. The grass would bow to her. She mopped her cheeks with a scarf wound around her right wrist. When she looked up at the sky, he saw her face. Only for a moment before the sharp shadow fell over her eyes and nose in the direction of the red dress. She leaned down and took a road map out of her case. A stranger, then? Not someone coming home. Or could you come home to a strange place? Could you come home at all? She belonged here, mistress of the green. But what would the pale people say? The pale people sitting in the village, chopping up their memories. She swore very well, like a drover. Then she laughed. A strange noise. Laughter. More penetrating than a bleat, and it didn't mean anything. The woman picked up her case again with a vigorous movement. You could tell she had put it down to think, and not because she needed a rest. Then, unexpectedly, she left the road. She almost found him in the tall grass. Fancy leaving the tarmac without fluttering her eyelashes or rolling her eyes. Most humans hesitate before stepping off their roads. They're suspicious. Their feet are tender, as if the ground were full of holes to make them stumble, and their first steps are like walking through mud. The woman had left the road decisively, like a sheep following her nose. She was still following her nose now, clever as a sheep, as she made her way towards the village. She hadn't let the road lead her astray. She'd make the pale people dance, swinging their spades in a big circle, something to look forward to. The sheep had always been sure that Gabriel must be an excellent shepherd, if only because of his clothes. In winter and summer alike, he wore a cape of undyed sheep's wool. Some even said it was unwashed sheep's wool. Gabriel smelled as much like a sheep as a human can, especially in wet weather. Gabriel knew how to pay a sheep compliments, not with words, as George sometimes did, though not often enough, but just by looking at the sheep with his blue eyes and never once blinking. That sort of thing tickled a sheep's soul and made it go weak at the knees. The sheep had great expectations of Gabriel's abilities as a shepherd. Not much had happened yet, however. Gabriel's dogs had briefly herded them together, and Gabriel had counted them without a single sound. Gabriel's dogs never barked. Ever. They just stared at the sheep, which was enough to make cold wolf fears chase up from their hoofs to the marrow of their bones. Gabriel was standing outside the shepherd's caravan, as silent as the dolmen. His blue eyes looked at every single sheep, one by one, as if he wanted to find out something. Almost imperceptibly, he nodded once at every sheep. Most of the sheep were sure that it had been an appreciative nod. Gabriel had inspected them and approved of them. It was exciting. They were a little proud, until Othello ruined their good mood. "He was counting us," he puffed in annoyance. "Just counting us, that's all." Unlike the rest of his flock, Othello had not been pleased to see the new shepherd. He stood apart from the others, thinking dark thoughts. An old anger sparkled in Othello's eyes. He recognized an animal tamer at once, the same few gestures, the same boredom in the eyes, the same malice behind that deceptive friendliness. The cruel clown had been a tamer too, using sugar and hunger and stealthy torment. He had implanted anger in Othello, and Othello was surprised to find that anger still so fresh and intact after all this time. But he would no longer give way to the anger just like that. He thought back to the day when he had learned to control his anger with patience. It was the day when the clown didn't close the shed door straight away, but instead bent over the box of props, turning his behind to Othello. Hungrily, Othello put his nose in the hay, but his eyes never left the clown's behind for a moment. He forgot the hay. He lowered his horns. At that moment, he heard the voice for the first time, a strangely dark, soft voice that had many things hidden in it. "Careful, Black Ram," said the voice behind him. "Your anger's already lowered its horns. You're seeing red, and if you don't watch out, your anger will gallop away from you." Othello didn't even turn around. "So?" he snorted. "So what? Why shouldn't it? He deserves it." A crow fluttered past outside the window. "But you don't deserve it," mocked the voice. "Who do you think you're turning your anger on? Not him? The man who grazes on fear, who drives terror into people? Your anger's turned on yourself. And once it charges you, you won't be able to stand up to it." Othello merely snorted. He kept his horns lowered and his eyes fixed on the clown, but he did not charge. "So what?" he snorted again. The voice did not reply. Othello turned. A gray ram with mighty horns stood behind him. A ram in the prime of life, all muscles and sinews and grace of movement under the thick fleece. His amber eyes sparkled with goblin light in the dark stable. Feeling awkward, Othello looked away. The clown emerged from the props box, slammed the stable door, and walked off. The world spun under Othello's feet in his disappointment. The strange ram nuzzled him. He smelled peculiar, of a great many things that Othello could not understand. "There now," the gray ram murmured in his ear. "Head like a drop of water on a branch, right? If your anger had galloped away, he'd have known you. He'd have seen over your horns into your eyes, into your heart. This way, he knows nothing. Everything he doesn't know is to your advantage." Find their weak points. The old game. Suddenly, the ram looked amused. Othello twitched his ears to get rid of all these words buzzing round him in the dark, but the gray ram gave him no time to get his breath back. "Forget your anger," said the ram now. Think of the snail's slimy trail in the grass. Think of the time ahead of you. But I'm angry, said Othello, just for something to say. Then fight, said the ram. How can I fight when he keeps me locked up, snorted Othello. Now that he had Othello's interest, the ram turned at monosyllabic as a mother ewe in a bad mood. Nothing helps. Thinking will help, said the ram. I do think, said Othello. I think day and night. It wasn't quite true, because at night he usually fell into an exhausted sleep in a corner of the stable. Then you're thinking of the wrong thing, said the ram, unimpressed. Othello said nothing. What do you think of? Asked the gray ram. Hay, admitted Othello in a small voice. As he had expected, the ram shook his head disapprovingly. Think of the way a mole's coat shines. Think of the sound the wind makes in the bushes and the feeling in your stomach when you trot down a slope. Think of the way the path smells ahead of you. Think of the freedom the wind is blowing your way, but never think of hay again. Othello looked at the gray ram. His stomach felt peculiar, but not with hunger. Or, if you want to keep it simple, said the gray ram, think of me. Othello thought of the gray ram, and his anger retreated behind his four horns where it belonged. The sheep in his flock were still looking at him with surprise. Gabriel was counting us, he told them grumpily. He was only counting us. Now that Othello said it, they thought so too, and they were disappointed. But their mood soon improved. If even being counted by Gabriel was such a friendly, mysterious process, they could imagine how exciting the really important things would turn out to be. Things like his filling the hay rack, spreading straw, and feeding them mangle wurzels. Most of all, they couldn't wait to find out what Gabriel would read aloud to them. Poetry, sighed Cordelia. They didn't know exactly what poetry was, but it must be beautiful because Pamela in the novels often had men reading poetry aloud to her in the moonlight. And George, who never had a good word to say about Pamela herself, would stop being so angry and sigh. Or something about Clover, said Mopple hopefully. About the sea and the sky and fearlessness, said Zora. Not about the diseases of the sheep anyway, said Heather. What do you think, Othello? Othello said nothing. He'll read in a good loud voice, loud and clear, just the way it should be, said Sir Richfield. He'll explain lots of new words to us, said Cordelia. They were getting more and more curious. What in the world would Gabrielle read to them? They could hardly wait for the afternoon reading time to come. Why don't we ask them? Suggested Cloud. She meant the other sheep, Gabrielle's own flock. Gabrielle's dogs had herded them together at one side of the meadow, and Gabrielle was busy putting a wire fence round them. George's sheep weren't sure what to think, because it made their meadow quite a bit smaller. Just where the mouseweed grows, grumbled Maud. The others didn't mind about the mouseweed. It was the general principle that bothered them. On the other hand, they were glad that Gabrielle's sheep wouldn't be running around with them, because they found them rather weird. Short legs, long backs, long and humorless noses, restless eyes, and peculiarly pale coloring. They didn't smell good either. Not unhealthy, but nervous and lifeless. The oddest thing about them was that they had almost no fleece, just a curly, dense down on their skin. Yet you could see they hadn't been shorn recently. Why did Gabrielle have such sheep that didn't grow wool? What was the use of them? How happy Gabriel must be now he had such a woolly flock as themselves at last. Soon he would send the other sheep away. Until then, they agreed, the best way of getting along with Gabriel's sheep was to ignore them. But now they were tormented by curiosity. I'd go and ask what he reads them, said Maud, only my nostrils itch when I get too close to them. They looked at Sir Richfield. As the lead ram, he could be expected to make contact with the strange flock. But Richfield shook his head. Patience, he snorted. Mopple didn't dare. Othello suddenly seemed to have lost all interest in literature, and the other sheep were too proud to speak to the fleeceless flock. Finally, Zora volunteered. She had done a great deal of thinking on her rocky ledge and believed that pride, however well justified, shouldn't prevent sheep from finding out as much as possible about the world. When Gabrielle was busy with a roll of wire netting behind the caravan, she trotted off. Gabrielle's sheep were grazing. The first thing Zora noticed about them was how close together they kept, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. It seemed uncomfortable grazing in such a cramped space. No one took any notice of Zora, although her scent must have reached them long before she did. She stopped just beyond the flock and waited politely for someone to speak to her. One or other of the sheep sometimes raised its head and looked nervously in all directions, but its eyes passed straight through Zora as if she were invisible. Zora watched them for a while in surprise. Then she lost patience and bleated loudly. Their muzzles stopped grazing, their necks rose. Countless pale eyes stared at her. Zora waited. She wasn't intimidated. There was the sky, the sea, and above all, her rock. Zora was used to looking into an abyss. She stood in front of them as if she were standing in a cold wind and faced them down. Perhaps it was a test to see how brave she was. Zora waggled her ears briskly and playfully pulled up a few blades of grass. Nothing happened. At the other side of the flock, a few of the sheep lowered their heads again, and a monotonous munching sound told her that they had gone back to grazing. But most of their eyes were still about Zora. She had to admit those eyes made her uneasy. There was a flickering light in them, the kind that sometimes played across the sky on days when the weather was very bad. On such days, a sheep could hardly think clearly at all. It was obvious to her that nothing was going to come of the other sheep. If anything was to happen here, then she, Zora, must make it happen. She took a glance back at her own flock, whose heads were turned her way. For a moment, it seemed as if even her own sheep were looking at her oddly. But then she realized that wasn't true. Sir Richfield was standing on the hill, looking stern and attentive. Cloud, Maud, Lane, and Cordelia had crowded together and were watching her expectantly. Excuse me. A little ahead of them stood Mopple, looking hard in her direction. Zora knew that at this distance he couldn't make out much more of her than a black and white blur. She was moved. Suddenly, it didn't seem difficult to speak to these strange sheep. "Hello," she called. She decided to try some harmless subject. "Do you like the grass around here?" she asked. It occurred to her, too late, that this might be taken badly, as alluding to the fact that they were tucking into other people's grazing. "The weather's not bad either," said Zora. This was a very safe subject. The sky was gray and warm. The air, refreshingly moist, and the meadow was fragrant. The strange sheep said nothing. A few of the heads that had been lowered to graze rose again. Perhaps they were just deep thinkers. Sheep. Perhaps they didn't care for idle chit-chat. Sheep. Who could say that intellectual books Gabrielle might have read aloud to them? "We could talk about how you get into the sky," suggested Zora. Gabrielle's sheep did not respond. "I mean, it must be possible somehow," Zora said. "We can see the cloud sheep in the sky after all. But how do you get there? Is there a place where you can just climb into the sky? Or do you just carry on grazing straight up into the air?" Zora looked at the sheep intently. Nothing. Or yes, a slight change. The unsettling flicker in the sheep's pale eyes was stronger now. Zora lost patience. "All right, I don't mind what you think about it, to be honest. I'm just about sure it's connected with conquering the abyss. But I certainly didn't come here to discuss that with you." She decided to be straightforward. "It's about Gabriel. He's been your shepherd for a long time. We want to know what he reads aloud to you." The sheep stared at her. Didn't they understand? That was impossible. No sheep could be so stupid. Zora snorted. "Your shepherd? Understand? Gabriel? Gabriel?" She turned her head briefly his way and saw that he had almost finished getting the next roll of wire netting ready. Time to be off. She turned to look at Gabriel's flock again and saw that still nothing had changed. A strange ram was standing right opposite Zora, only a few steps away. She cast him a last furious glance and stopped. Had he been there before? She couldn't recall. She saw that the strange sheep weren't so small after all, rather short in the legs, yes, but long in the body and heavily built. The ram opposite her made a very powerful impression that reminded Zora of the butcher. She had meant to say something sarcastic and scornful by way of goodbye, but now she thought it would be better to get out, fast. The ram looked at her, and it seemed to Zora that the strange flickering had gone from his eyes. For the first time, she felt that he was really looking at her. The ram slowly and almost imperceptibly shook his head. Zora turned and galloped straight back to her rocky ledge. Gabrielle finished the fence around midday. He sat down on the steps of the shepherd's caravan where George always sat to smoke a pipe. The fine tobacco fumes rose to the sheep's noses in a strange way. Behind the veil of smoke, the real Gabrielle was hidden, in a place where no sheep could pick up his scent. Even Maud had to admit that she could tell very little about Gabrielle himself beneath those aromas of sheep's wool and tobacco. The middle of the day was more peaceful than they'd known it in a long time. The mild sun, half covered by hazy clouds, was part of it, and so were the magnificent views of a spotlessly blue sea and the humming of the insects. But the best part was relief at knowing such an efficient shepherd was sitting on the caravan steps and looking forward to Gabrielle's stories when twilight fell. When the man on the bicycle raced towards them, however, the peace and quiet were suddenly gone. The sheep didn't trust bicycles. They withdrew to the hill for safety, but the man on the bike wasn't after them. He was making straight for Gabrielle. Once they were at a safe distance, the sheep calmed down slightly and turned their nervous ears towards the shepherd's caravan. They recognized him as soon as he got off his bicycle and stood right in front of Gabrielle. He had come with Lily, Ham, and Gabrielle, and was the first human to examine George's body. It was Josh, the tall, thin man who had pressed his nose against the windows of the shepherd's caravan last night. He had the scent of alcohol on his fingers, and he also smelled of soapy water and unwashed feet. His aura was slightly rancid. Mopple hid behind the dolmen and peered anxiously out between the stones. Braver sheep like Othello, Cloud, and Zora, feeling curious, trotted closer. "Josh," said Gabrielle, without taking his pipe out of his mouth. His blue eyes were fixed on the thin man. The sheep knew how he must be feeling at this moment. There would be a flattered expression on his face, and he'd be a little weak in the knees. The thin man rummaged around nervously in his jacket pocket, found a key, and held it out to Gabrielle. "It's from Kate. She just found it in a box of oat cakes. Would you believe it?" said the thin man with a laugh. The sheep understood why he was so nervous. He had probably eaten the oat cakes. "Kate thinks it must be in the caravan," said the thin man, "because it's certainly not in the house." "Right," said Gabrielle. He took the key and put it down carelessly on the top step of the caravan. "Gabrielle?" asked the thin man. A magpie flew curiously over the roof of the shepherd's caravan. "Suppose we don't find it, then what?" "So long as nobody else finds it either," said Gabrielle. His blue eyes were searching the blue sea while clouds of smoke wafted out of his mouth. "Do you know what they're saying, Gabrielle?" Gabrielle looked as if he didn't know and didn't want to. All the same, the thin man went on. "They're saying it's not in the caravan at all. They say it's all in the will." "Then if that's right, we'll find out on Sunday," said Gabrielle. The thin man made a nervous sound. Then he hunched his head down between his shoulders and walked back to the bicycle. After about 3 steps, Gabrielle called him back. "By the way, Josh." "Yes, Gabrielle?" "There's been enough nonsense going on around here, see? You want to make sure it stops? Now." "Nonsense? How do you mean, Gabrielle?" Josh sounded alarmed. "Well, like midnight expeditions to George's caravan, for instance." "What's the idea?" "You'll only scare the sheep." Cloud was touched. Even now, Gabrielle was thinking of them. Josh didn't seem to want to discuss last night. "What sort of sheep are those anyway?" asked the pub landlord, looking critically at Gabrielle's sheep and speaking very fast. "They look odd, they do. I never saw sheep like that before." "A new meat breed," said Gabrielle out of the corner of his mouth. His blue eyes were fixed on Josh. The two men said no more for quite a time. Then Josh sighed. You really know everything, right? Gabrielle said something in Gaelic. The sheep wondered if he had a second tongue in his mouth for speaking that language. It couldn't be helped, said Josh. Tom and Harry would have gone anyway, the idiots that they are. Find the grass, avoid scandal, keep the tourist trade going, the same old story. As if that was it. They've no idea that they haven't. So I thought I'd better be there than not. See what I mean? I gave them a wrong key, so they wouldn't bring any tools, but they'd be sure to not get in. Gabrielle nodded understandingly, and Josh was obviously relieved. Talking seemed to come more easily to him now. You know something, though, he said. We wasn't the only ones. There was someone else around, a stranger. One of the drugs people, if you ask me. So there's something going on, if they find it before we do. The magpie flew back over Gabrielle and Josh. Of course, there was no saying whether or not it was the same magpie, but it described an elegant curve and landed on the roof of the shepherd's caravan, chattering away. They won't find it, said Gabrielle. They don't know anything about the cassette. They're just after their stuff. Anyway, I'm here now. You want to get folks in the pub to calm down? Josh nodded enthusiastically. The sheep knew just how he felt. It was his pleasure to do Gabrielle a favor. Gabrielle, Josh had been on his way again, but turned back once more. Gabrielle shifted his pipe from the right to the left corner of his mouth and looked inquiringly at Josh. You fixed all this really good. He waved his hand in a gesture, taking in Gabriel, the shepherd's caravan, the sheep, and the whole meadow. Gabrielle nodded. The sheep need a bit of looking after, at least until the will is read. They were really grateful to me in the management office. Animal welfare, hygiene, regulations, and that. And I'm saving on grazing for my own. He smiled, an engaging smile. And of course I can sit here, he added, slapping the steps of the caravan with his hand, just as long as I like. Josh grinned with relief. Excuse me. This is part of my esophagus issues. Oh my gosh. I'm amazed that I can read this much. Josh grinned with relief. He nodded goodbye to Gabrielle, mounted his bike, and clattered away in the direction of the village. As soon as Josh had disappeared round the bend in the path across the fields, Gabrielle's brown hand came down on the top step of the caravan, but it felt around in vain. The key was no longer there. It was clinking and shining at Gabrielle from high up on the roof of the shepherd's caravan, in a magpie's beak. In Gabrielle's care, the sheep were more ambitious than they had been for a long time. They grazed conscientiously, taking long, straight steps. They craned their necks gracefully. They felt they were being good doers, and even ate the dry, less tasty grass with pleasure. When they rested in the shade of the old hay barn, they held their heads high and watched Gabrielle out of the corner of their eyes. Gabrielle was running after a magpie, like a lamb frolicking in high spirits, chasing from bush to tree, from tree to shrub, back and forth all across the meadow. Oh, that's it. I'm so confused, because didn't I just start with chapter 7? Hold on. Did I start with chapter 8? I'm so lost. I've been reading this book for now several days. Well, anyway, that's the end of chapter 8. 3 bags full, Leonie, Swann. This is a lot for me. In a multitude of ways. Reasons. Why? Reading a book aloud? Don't we all do that at some point in our lives? Me as a lady figure, a maternal figure, raising my own daughters. Of course I've read out loud most of my life. And yet this, reading aloud of this book, 3 bags full, is most special to me because it is not for a child. It is for my mother, and it is for me, who otherwise, if I didn't create it to be for my mother, would not allow it to be for me. So I'm grateful to be sharing this book in audio, video mode for my mother.